Christina Sharpe is a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Black Studies and the Humanities at York University in Toronto, and the author of Monstrous Intimacies, Making Post-Slavery Subjects, In the Wake, On Blackness and Being, and Ordinary Notes. She has written for many artist catalogs and is the co-editor of Theory Q with Lee Edelman and Benjamin Kahan.
In December, Protean published Notes on Craft, Writing in the Hour of Genocide, by the Palestinian-American writer Fargo Nissim Tabaki. Tabaki names craft as, quote, the network of sanitizing influences exerted on writing in the English language, end quote, by the professional context through which it circulates and acquires prestige, including universities and publishing houses, quote, the influences of neoliberalism, of complicit institutions, and of the linguistic priorities of the state and of empire. He continues, above all, craft is the result of market forces. It is therefore the result of imperial forces, as the two are so inextricably bound up together as to be one and the same. The craft which is taught in Western institutions, taken up and rewarded by Western publishers, literary institutions, and awards bodies, is a set of regulatory ideas which curtail forms of speech that might enact real danger to the constellation of economic and social values, which are, as I write, facilitating genocide in Palestine and elsewhere across the globe. If, as Audre Lorde taught us, the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house, then craft is the process by which our own real liberatory tools are dulled, confiscated, and replaced. That's a quote. So craft tells us that the market matters. Craft tells us to modulate our words. Craft tells us that if we do it well enough, they will listen. Craft tells us to be silent about genocide, to be silent about genocides, about anti-blackness and white supremacy. Craft, Tabaki continues, is a machine for regulation, estrangement, and sanitation. But Tabaki also notes that anti-colonial writers in the US and around the globe have long modeled alternative crafts which reject these priorities and continue to do so in this present moment. Instead of craft, I think about work, the work that we writers are doing now as we try to attend to the violent world and also to what might be in excess of it. What are the words and forms with which to do and say and make what we need to live in now? Not only in some future time, but now, what is our work to be isn't a grand question. It's a simple question, the question at the base of our writing. Writers who try to do this work are told that our words don't matter. When we demand a ceasefire and an end to occupation, we're told that those words are meaningless, that they do not prompt action, and that they cause tremendous injury. As in, to demand a ceasefire or to demand that the genocide in Gaza end is to cause injury and not to demand the cessation of injury. To name a person, institution, state, or set of acts as racist or anti-Palestinian or anti-black is to cause injury. It is not the racism that injures. It is not the bullets and bombs that injure. It is the words that seek to name the injury, that name a murderous structure like apartheid or settler colonialism that cause injury. Meaning is in crisis, and we are embroiled everywhere in contests over meaning, which are also contests of power, contests over living and dying. When Anne Boyer resigned as poetry editor of the New York Times Magazine in November 2023, she wrote on her Substack, quote, because our status quo is self-expression, sometimes the most effective mode of protest for artists to use is to refuse. I can't write about poetry amidst the reasonable tones of those who aim to acclimatize us to this unreasonable suffering. No more ghoulish euphemisms, no more verbally sanitized hellscapes, no more warmongering lies. If this resignation leaves a hole in the news the size of poetry, then that is the true shape of the present.
Christina. Thank you for reading that. It's such a powerful essay about the responsibility of the writer, the work of the writer amid parallel, overlapping, ongoing crises and forms of violence and the role of grief in those unfolding violences. And I remember feeling, as you shared the early drafts with us, the kind of, it felt so present in that you were working with sort of essays that were coming out as you were writing, tweets, news events. It sort of felt like it was taking the moment as it was unfolding it and giving it a kind of shape, which makes me wonder how it feels to revisit it a few months later, if your thinking has changed at all or evolved, or if it feels continuous with now. Yeah, what does that feel like?
Thank you for that. I think because I'm also working on a book that is what I call an inventory essay. It's working. I like to work with particular words and phrases to see what they can bear. And this book is called What Could a Vessel Be? And so I'm working with vessel as form, as object, as container, as ship, etc. And thinking about, what the word and the those actual material things and what the idea of a vessel might bear or not bear, how it might expand, etc. And so I think that, thinking of this essay as a kind of container for the kind of ongoing catastrophes, ongoing and simultaneous catastrophes that that just seem to be accumulating, kind of like that snowball building into the sort of massive boulder that will be a kind of, lead to some kind of avalanche. And so revisiting it, it feels too present still, that if anything, we see that things have gotten worse, not better. The ability to speak to ongoing genocides, the ability to speak on campuses, the ability to speak in classrooms, in our places of work, is really endangered. And so, as I was struggling with having to write something new, I kept trying to think about how do I speak into this deeply precarious present in which our speaking and writing is utterly necessary. And also, we're told continually our words don't matter, but we see that they do. So sort of to resist that, well, it doesn't matter if I say something, because it actually does. So I think I've answered your question, that it feels all too close and relevant in a way that I wish it didn't.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It also sort of, I wonder if there's a kind of complementary question about method and about how you work that comes out of what you just said, in the sense that, you so elegantly weave together all these disparate but related materials, and your books do that too, each in their kind of own way. And I'm curious how much, sort of what the role of chance and accident and sort of stumbling upon things is, versus do you kind of keep a store or accrue images and reference that you then carefully place? How does that work?
Well, I'm kind of obsessive, so I will, and so every once in a while I have to clear my desktop in this really efficient way in which I have a folder that's called Untitled 10, and I shove everything in it. But I accumulate, essays and articles and notes of things. So Ordinary Notes began, my last published book began because I had a folder on my desktop called Notes Towards Something. And so I would write things and stick them in there and think, one day I'm going to have a place to put these things. So my method is I'm an accumulator. I get obsessed by things and I will think about them over the course of years. I was struck by Lydia Davis talking about cows, and over the course of 3 years writing 80 phrases or sentences. I think that's the kind of thing that I would do. And probably have done, hence Ordinary Notes. And so part of it is happenstance, part of it is an attention and a kind of inventory making that is part of the process of the way that I've always worked. and a kind of sense of making connections that make sense to me that I then have to work to for others to make sense. So my first book is Monstrous Intimacies, and it's an academic book in which I look at, a writer from the US, a South African writer, and the figure of Saartjie Baartman, Isaac Julian, and the figure of abolition in England, and Carol Walker. And it didn't make sense to people that I was talking about both a US writer, but who also writes about slavery in Brazil and the US, Black Britain, South Africa, and the US all together. But it made perfect sense to me, partially because what joined them all was the figure of slavery, and then how it was enacted and how these writers were thinking about it in these various locations. So that's kind of how my brain works in that way, by juxtaposition. I often tell people, I don't think logically, I think juxtapositionally, or rather that is my logic.
Yeah, and the essay and the issue is structured as a series of numbered sections in a way that feels sort of continuous with or resonant of Ordinary Notes, but also the rhythm and the logic of it feels a bit different, and it makes me wonder if about the form of this new project you're working on, and if you see a formal trajectory to your work, the shape of it, where you want to go next with that.
Yeah, so maybe I shouldn't talk about my work. maybe I should be superstitious, but I feel like each project, it's been really beautiful because, I started out really just as an academic who didn't think of herself as a writer, and now I really do think of myself as a writer who's also a professor. And that's been a kind of beautiful and interesting change. I'm very happy about that. And so I feel like each project demands its own form and shape. So In the Wake was its own shape. Ordinary Notes is its own shape. And What Could a Vessel Be, as I say, is a kind of inventory essay, which works by accumulation, but also an ekphrasis, and a kind of cataloging of a catastrophe, but also what interrupts catastrophe. Then I have another book that I'm working on, which is called Black Still Life. And that's completely changed. And I think that is going to think, I'm really fascinated with epiphytes and moss. And so I'm really thinking of dust, epiphyte, moss, as the kind of organizing, and as the kind of organizing structure for that book. And so, each thing kind of really does call for its own form in its own way of attending to my continuing obsessions, which are about Black life and the ways that it is shaped by violence, but also what's in excess of that. And I just think that, that form changes over time.
Well, I can't wait to read them. And maybe now it's your turn to choose. Which was favorites, is that right? Favorites. Thanks for being a good sport. Favorites. What was your favorite piece of writing when you were a college student, if you remember?
I do remember. My favorite piece of writing when I was a college student was Bessie Head's A Question of Power.
Bessie Head's A Question of Power. Great. Well, thank you, Christina. I really appreciate it. And one more time for all four of our readers today.